IBM released a Laban notation typing element for its popular Selectric typewriter in 1973 with the help of the Dance Notation Bureau. Though this dance typewriter never took off, we are going to look at what its development, public image, and function show us about women's work in dance notation. Laban notation is a graphic language for describing movement, first published in Germany in 1928 and then fleshed out in the following decades by notators around the world. Although also known in some places as Kinetography, Laban is a recognized language for movement analysis with applications in fields such as dance preservation, robotics, and anthropology, and implications for United States copyright law of dance. Symbols in Labanotation are placed on a vertical staff that is much like a music notation staff turned on its side. These indicate direction and in space and body parts, and then timing runs vertically up the page. The taller something is, the longer it takes. On the right here is an example of a page of handwritten Laban notation created in 1969 by Tony Intravaya. It is written in pencil on staff paper, which is 8 pitch or 8 square per inch graph paper, with 4 pre-printed staves running up the page. The words on the page are written with an IBM Selectric typewriter. Tony Intravaya was a big fan, but the symbols on this page are not the Labanotation symbols are not typewritten because this is from 1969, before the Labanotation typeball was released. This is a really short Labanotation score, and it shows one dancer's part, but a longer score for a group dance would be more complex, and it could be up to hundreds of pages of notation. And so what this means is that Labanotation takes a lot of symbols to write. As late leading notator Anne Hutchinson Guest has said, Labanotation is a longhand for movement and not a shorthand. And what she meant by this is that Labanotation granularizes movement. It takes a moment of movement and breaks it out into where each body part is in space with multiple symbols across the staff. It doesn't roll off of the hand or the pen when handwriting, like word writing might, or like script word writing especially. It's not one row in typewriting, it's not going to be one row of alphabetical letters going across the page. The process of arriving at a clean score like the one shown here comes in several stages of drafts. First, notators analyze movement and they choose the best combinations of symbols to capture it in a translation process. They're working live in the studio with dancers or possibly off of moving image. And working this way, they would start by creating a draft score using lots of paper, probably lined paper like a legal pad or notebook paper, and much more simple constructions of the notation, a type of shorthand for themselves as they work. And then later, when they're not in the time-sensitive rehearsal process, they add details. So in the process, they've fully embodied the movement, they've danced it in order to be able to break it down into its parts. They take this added detail and then they finally transcribe everything into a clean copy that has everything sketched out in exactly the precisely correct place on the page. The typeball's development and design started in 1966 and it was released in 1973. So this time period is over 250 years after the typewriter had transformed office life and eventually created the woman's role of typist, as women were thought to be especially suited for typing with supposedly their delicate fingers and fine motor ability. This mid-60s is also the women's liberation and civil rights movement, and it was a really good time for theatrical dance in the United States that had received an infusion of Cold War era cultural funding that advanced dance activity and built audiences. And the Dance Notation Bureau had grown from 4 women who founded it in 1940 into a fully formed service organization by the mid-1960s. They had a board, paid staff notators, and copyists for the notation. And it was also, the Dance Notation Bureau was also reorganizing at this time at the urging of its board. And the IBM Selectric had just come on the scene in 1961. It, in general, was a great success. It made it possible to change out fonts and make corrections while typing really quickly. IBM had been and is, or has been, a company that looked for collaborations in the arts and sciences and novel problems to solve. So this seemed like it could be an opportunity for the Dance Notation Bureau to upgrade the physical production of notation scores. Material production of Labanotation had historically been very laborious. Notators generally used pencil and readied their scores for duplication with more pencil or hand inking or wax stencils. They usually used graph paper. They also used sometimes different formats that would free up their hands and free up their body for dancing while reading. So they used cutout symbols of cardboard that could be placed on the floor and rearranged and danced over, and scrolls that you can see here in the picture on the wall behind the women that could be hung on the wall, freeing up hands. Notators had been discussing how they could speed up the process of producing scores and teaching materials for decades, and thought they might find a way to design a dedicated typewriter for dance. And they never did design a dedicated typewriter, but the Selectric comes into this story. The workers of the Dance Notation Bureau were at this time entirely women and remained almost entirely women. They often worked as volunteers and they worked for little pay. Here is a photograph of some of the women of the Dance Notation Bureau seated around the table, around their scores, and in front of their wall of scrolls. These American notators were instrumental in refining the system of Laban notation into the functioning one that it is today. And along the way, they developed and operated an impressive circulating library of hundreds of theatrical dance scores, folk dance scores, and volumes of teaching material. And all of this has become part of the archival record of the ephemeral art form of dance in the United States. So it's quite important. These women were also simultaneously operating a service organization to promote and record the art form of dance. But their history, the history of Labanotation in the United States, has been little written about. And is it possible that some of this neglect is because of it being primarily a women's history and because dance is a feminized art form? The history of United States notators intersected with the history of typing in 1966, when Dance Notation Bureau board member Early Bell, who was at the time urging the Bureau to modernize and become more mainstream and businesslike, worked with dancer and notator Lucy Venable, who's here second from the right in the glasses, and with Earl Crow from IBM to design a way to type Laban notation. What does the story of the Labanotation typeball tell us about the history of Labanotation and its women promoters? From a feminist perspective, I frame both the production of dance notation material, texts, and typing in 1966 to 1973 as types of women's work. That is, work typically done by women that is regarded as a lower status than the work of men. How did this notion of women's work impact the way the ball was developed and perceived? I propose that the perception that the Labanotation typeball was a tool for women's work marked the process of its design and marketing in several ways. I looked at what notators thought they were doing as shown from their internal correspondence with each other, and then what public image IBM, the Dance Notation Bureau, board, and the notators presented about the language, the system, and about the typeball, and how this public image differed from the internal concept. Where were gendered concepts of work inscribed or subverted here? First, we'll look at the function of the Selectric. The Labanotation keyboard for the IBM Selectric placed Labanotation symbols or their parts over the 88 keys of the typewriter, as shown here in the schematic on the right that went into the typewriter's manual, and you could make a copy of this and paste it right over the typewriter keys. So these symbols get placed over where letters and numbers would be, but Labanotation is not alphabetical. Compared to the 88 options here on the typewriter keyboard, which is the 44 keys times 2 with the shift, there are somewhere between 500 to 1,000 Labanotation symbols possible. And that's not even considering the range of resizing that's necessary for any symbol that can be lengthened to show a longer duration. So as a result, it required up to it required at least 12 keystrokes to make one of the most basic Labanotation symbols a regular length forward walking step. In addition to all those keystrokes, you needed backspacing, adjustments of the roll, and handwriting after the fact. As Yvette Elanya wrote in her version of the manual that she wrote for the French audience and translated into English, quote, "You must consider each sign as a word, starting from the principle that any auxiliary operations such as reverse motion, use of the spacing bar and of the half spacing lever, roll, lifting, and lowering, etc., are part of this word. So that forward stepping symbol, if it's a regular duration forward step, needed all of those other actions as you typed a word. It's a choreography of typing that's a bit more complex than typing a word that's a sequence of letters and then a space." And Labanotation symbols aren't words. You're essentially composing these symbols with the keys. So this is a more complex process than typing words. And furthermore, dance is not verbal. Nothing in dance corresponds directly with words. Dance is body movement in space and time. So we're trying to capture space and time in symbol through typewriter keys. This is a lot of translation. Furthermore, the left to right orientation of typing English words didn't match the vertical orientation of Labanotation. So a typist had to mentally rotate 90 degrees the whole time they worked. I suggest that there is a conceptual disconnect between Labanotation as it's written and typing words that no one quite reckoned with in the original part of this design process in 1966. This is a logocentric assumption that body movement is somehow subject to or dependent upon, or at least corresponding to in syntax, verbal language, when really they're entirely different. Notators, like the ones shown here, Lucy Venable and Muriel Topaz, were experts and artisans in writing Labanotation and creating material texts of notation, and they realized this early in the process. They realized this first. So the process, again, the design started in 1966. It stalled in 1968 when Lucy Venable left the Dance Notation Bureau to come to Ohio State to join the faculty in Ohio. In 1970, a few years after the project stalled out, Lucy wrote to Muriel Topaz, another expert notator, and she was asking, Muriel Topaz had been asking, should I continue this project? Venable was somewhat discouraging. She wrote, "If we stick to the system," meaning the Labanotation system, "without modifications, then I do not know how much time will be saved." She cited reasons like the ones that I just mentioned about how the typing would actually be cumbersome. And she basically was acknowledging to Muriel Topaz, this typewriter is not going to make things more efficient. At the same time, she didn't fully discourage Topaz from continuing, but for other reasons. She also wrote, one of the original ideas for typing a score was to feed a tape into a computer where the information could be stored, recalled, or used in other ways upon demand. Venable's thinking had leapt over typewriting to away from designing a material production solution and towards thinking about what else Labanotation could do if it could only be tied to an input. It seems that grappling with this input of the keyboard really got Venable thinking about the possibilities of computing with movement. And this type of forward thinking is really in line with the way notators thought about what they were doing. They sometimes presented themselves or described their work as being a scribe of Labanotation or a scribe of dance, but they were really historians, they were theorists, and they were writing dance of the 20th century and thinking about what the information in dances mean. The Dance Notation Bureau did pick the process back up. There were some delays, but the ball was released in 1973 and it was offered for $18. As far as we know, none of the balls were sold. But the marketing shows some different strategies for how the type ball for dance, the value was narrated to the public and how people described its importance or its usefulness. IBM's marketing on the left associates the type ball with a beautiful, slight female ballet dancer who's sitting behind the Selectric with her legs crossed. And she really is giving off feminine appeal. It's a lot like an automobile ad with a model on the hood, or like other IBM ads at the time that objectified the secretary as a lovely lady of the office. Her crossed legs recall the crossed legs of a secretary underneath the desk. She needs to be demure and ladylike. In effect, this ad reduces dancing womanhood and presents her as decoration. On the right, the Dance Notation Bureau made an informational one-pager that associates the type ball with the type of analysis of movement that Venable was thinking about. It interestingly draws on 3 non-dance activities: sailing, football, and horse racing, pointing to the idea that the notation had broad applications in movement analysis. However, it also completely disassociates Labanotation from its history with women and dance. It doesn't show anyone notating or using a typewriter who would probably have been a woman, because these are who populated the Dance Notation Bureau. And it also obscures notators' knowledge that dance had always, or that Labanotation had always been capable of analyzing all sorts of movement. The typewriter did not make that possible. It just made a way to type those things. So in different ways, these presentations of the type ball's public image are strategic. They reflect what the organizations consider to be marketable about the type ball. And because dance and typing were seen as women's work, the accepted marketing strategy was through the women as a decorative object, or through aligning the project with masculinized movement and distancing it from women's work. A few publications for teaching purposes did use the type ball to make short one-measure items that could be placed on a page with typewritten word text. And the copy was nice and clear for those, but no full scores, 100 pages of notation were ever produced with the type ball. And strangely though, even into the 1970s, the Dance Notation Bureau's board members, who were not themselves notators, touted the fact of the ball's existence in the press, claiming that it had sped up notation production. But the type ball never saved time. Notators continued and continue today to produce their initial scores by hand. Now there's computing solutions, and notators like Lucy Venable went on to explore what computing solutions were possible with notation. Thus, the Labanotation type ball's history suggests a disconnect between the value notators put on their own work and a lesser value assigned to their work by the public. To notators, they were materially recording a library of dances with their pencils on paper as they were simultaneously building, testing, teaching, and working out a textual practice for movement. However, in their public image, they were doing clerical work, women's work, the work of the secretary. I can't say this disconnect between public image and private conception is why the typewriter was a commercial failure, but there is enough dissonance here that it matters. It's an important story to those who love dance as an art form and a site of knowledge, but also to anyone concerned about how anti-woman sentiment might block innovation and the production of knowledge. The history of the Labanotation type ball matters for those looking for ways to understand women's role in the production of material texts of dance. Thank you.